Okay, what a privilege to hear from Mike. And our last speaker is Bob Klaber. Bob, like many of our speakers, probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but Bob is a paediatrician at Imperial, and we've crossed paths. We're contemporaries. We've crossed paths in our training a few times. We're also friends. We have mutual friends, so we go back quite a long way. Bob's one of those annoying people who's just very good at his job. He's in all sorts of powerful leadership positions, and is the sort of person you want to hang on to his coattails. So whenever I get the chance, I do that with Bob and try and associate myself with him. There was one time when I was struggling with a leadership issue of my own, and I gave Bob a ring, and he was very gratefully, you may remember this, I was pacing around in my garden, and he just said, listen to the issue I was having, and he just said, look, Adrian, just put the patient first. What's right for the patient? Such a basic intervention, and it made everything much easier for me. So much wisdom from you, Bob. Bob's going to talk about kindness.
Thanks. I'm trying to work out whether just to say that's a load of rubbish and what's he talking about, or just to say thank you and shut up and follow Mike's advice. I'm uncertain. Thank you. Thanks for the lovely intro. And listen, it's a total privilege to be here. Feel moderately fraudulent as well, and also recognise what an amazing day you've had. And I've been lucky enough to be here for the last couple of talks and conversations, just incredible stuff. And then there's a drinks reception. So I'm the sort of, thin layer of something in between that. But there's an important sort of conversation, and I want to share a few bits and pieces related to kindness and hope. That is I do a little bit on Twitter and stuff. That's if those of you who are tweeting, feel free to do something. This isn't mine. I couldn't sort of find it somewhere in the archives. Put your hand up if you've done a strength scope based 360. Has anyone done? You've all done 360s. You know that thing where people ask you for something to improve and they write a bit. A few of you have done these ones. So when I did my version of this, the things that were really, so you ask people for, what are your strengths? And the things that came up really sort of, in the purpley colour for me were energy, enthusiasm, optimism. I mean, perfect for a talk on hope and things like that. Now, the point of strength scope stuff is it gives you this feedback that sort of says, okay, these are great. They're good things to have feedback on, aren't they? Energy and enthusiasm, optimism. And then in essence, the sort of coaching around it says, right, let's dial the volume up on them, shall we? And how does everyone else around you feel? Okay, that's how I remember this. So with that energetic, enthusiastic optimist, I have two colleagues of mine who complain they always feel exhausted after spending time with me, that I steal their energy. Anyway, listen, for once I feel happy about this, because among all of you here, it's a really safe place to be an energetic, enthusiast optimist. So just that was a little bit of background. On that note, stick your hand up if you've read this book. Yeah, I thought there'd be quite a few people. If you haven't, I'd really, really recommend it. I suspect lots of you are at the same sort of stage of life as me, as sort of reading is a bit difficult with lots of things going on. But he's a Dutch historian, and there's a book called Utopia for Realists that some of you might have written, and I think this and Humankind are the two that have been translated into English. And essentially, it's a fabulous history lesson that goes back and challenges this premise that a lot of researchers over many centuries, philosophers and others, have argued that humans are very self-interested. And a lot, if you look at the science and philosophy, that's a very common narrative. And he basically sort of goes back on that and really makes a good effort at trying to dismantle it. And says, actually, humankind, and plays in on that word kind, that the starting point is actually one of hope, one of generosity. And I think that's a pretty healthy and helpful premise for us to have, because things are pretty tough, aren't they? At whatever level we're looking at, whether it's our work or whether it's things going on in our country or whether it's things on a global basis, and we've been hearing about and thinking about some of those things. So it's a very hopeful book. It's a very optimistic book, but sort of grounded in good and interesting argument. And I think it's always good to go and be curious about other different things. So there's quite a few paediatricians and people who work in peds in and around, and lots of sort of smiling. A couple of really wonderful paediatricians were key in this work about 20, 24 years ago, around defining quality. And these domains of quality in the US were published in a paper called Crossing the Quality Chasm, and I think are really relevant today. And the CQC and others have come along since and tried to sort of reshape a little bit of the language. But I think this stuff really sticks. Care needs to be effective. I guess we'd say person-centered now rather than patient-centered. Timely is a massive issue for us at the moment. A lot of your day today will have been focused on safety, efficient, and then this piece about equity, equitable care. We sort of kicked in the long grass for 20 years or so from this, but thankfully starting to think about it. So I guess this conversation, and I think when I look back at what you've been up to today, and when you're going back on Monday and explaining where you've been, it's sort of easy for people to dismiss a bit and say, oh, well, that sounds great. Probably a bit happy-clappy and, you know, all of this sort of narrative. This is the hard edge of stuff. This is about quality. This is about care. This is about what the work is. And I think there's something really important about how we get a little bit more bold and a little bit more on the front foot around that. So, a little story about me. Now, one of the things that you sort of learn when you tell stories, it's like deeply boring to tell stories about you in terms of what you've done and all these things. It's really not interesting. But I think what's more important, and it plays to Mike's point about appreciation, is a bit about what you stand for. You know, what matters to you would be a good phrase. So I was sat in Glasgow, and there will have been 3 or 4 people in the room at least who will have been there. So Nikki Early, you will have been there. You can see the date, it's like time-stamped. 29th of March, 2019. So 4.5 years ago, I was in Glasgow in that great big conference centre, the SEC conference centre, I got the acronym right. And I was listening to Don Berwick and Maureen Bigciano talking about healthcare. And they are just, there's nobody better than that pair talking about all the sort of current things going on. And they had this one slide up, and I'll come to the detail a bit later, about hello, that's better. They were talking about kindness, and I sat there listening, and really properly listening and thinking, I've made a mistake. I've got this wrong. I've got the framing of this wrong. So I had definitely all my, I guess my upbringing. Emma's known me for a very long time, so she can comment and tell you I'm talking nonsense later. But my 20s and 30s was definitely big on this idea around kindness, but I always framed it around a little bit of a defensive piece. I know it's soft and fluffy, and I argue why it was important. And this moment, I completely pivoted. So it's not a soft and fluffy thing. This is absolutely the starting point. So if you want to have a conversation about safety, you have to get this stuff right. If you want to talk about money, you've got to get this stuff right. If you want to talk about equity, about racism, about all of the big things we really care about, you have to get this right. So this is not on the side. This is an absolute prerequisite, a starting point. So I think my record tweet ever before was sort of 3 likes and a retweet or something. What I found was a load of people said, yeah, count me in. I'm onto this. I want to do something more about this. And that's a little bit where this story goes. So Adrian asked me to use some slides. Now, quite often I get this sort of thing when I've done a talk and things, and the people organising a conference say, dear Bob, where are your slides? And I sort of, it's about 2 weeks before, and I sort of write, say, dear Susan, dear John, there are no slides, and there will not be any slides, and things. But Adrian he's very lovely and convincing, so I said, I promise I'll give you a few slides. You want to sort of balance it up. So, I'm a bit of an educationalist. I do love teaching and have done lots on this stuff. There will be different of you in the room who different things will land for you. So I'm going to try and give a few different things now as a quick, maybe 5-6 minutes, whistle through some of the evidence that's around there, some of the theory, some of the evidence. This is a wonderful bit of work. It's a really slim book. The second edition of it's got a very different cover. But John Ballot and Penny Campling, the original book's about 15, 16 years old. And they're the first people I'm aware of who really put this sort of theory down that if you have a real unrelenting focus on kinship, that promotes kindness. It leads to people being more attentive to each other, which is the attentiveness bit. They tune into each other, it builds trust, and it forms a therapeutic alliance. It leads to better outcomes. And they talk about this in the context of sort of doctor-patient, but actually colleague-colleague, and they talk about it in the context of organizations. And when you think about the evidence that continues to build, Mike was talking about, it's great, you've got an ex-baseball player talking about serotonin and oxytocin and things like that. Saves the science for me. But he's absolutely right. There's a growing evidence base around this. You start to understand how this stuff works. Emma, I think, mentioned this earlier. This is a really wonderful bit. Any of you got on a Teams call with me or a Zoom call with me? This sort of sits on the wall behind me. This is Julia Unwin's work at the Carnegie UK Trust. Carnegie UK Trust is worth looking up. Fabulous organisation that's invested lots of research in this space. There's a beautiful paper on measurement of kindness that they've done. But this is Julia Unwin's work from about 4 years ago, where she was talking about the two lexicons of public policy, the rational and the relational. And we're keeping momentum on time, but in essence, what she says, in this country, we have been very largely focused on this blue rational lexicon. When you think about any sort of public policy, but particularly think about healthcare, think about post-mid staffs, this focus on we want to have fair, balanced, safe healthcare. Absolutely. I'm definitely up for that. And so we had a whole raft of these things on the blue rational lexicon put into place. But what was missing was this orange side, about the relational side. And you guys, in the sort of people you are coming here, and everything you've been doing today has all been focused, I suspect, on that rational lexicon. And what Julia Unwin argues, you've got to have both. So leadership is here about having both. And we have a problem in our healthcare system at the minute. We're wildly dominating on that blue rational lexicon. So in fact, I had a great conversation with Adrian and Chris when we were just sort of kicking this around a bit before about measurement. So one of the biases that goes on is the guys who are really promoting lots of the blue rational only stuff own measurement. They say things like, you can't measure civility. You can't measure culture. You can't measure trust. You can't measure relationships. Total nonsense. Okay, you can completely measure them. And actually, I'd argue they're just as easy to measure as measuring the money. And so it's a complete power grab. Okay, so we've got to be, because people value the things that you can measure. Now, whether we choose to measure kindness and civility and trust, relationships, is a great question, and we can make those choices. But can you measure them? You definitely can measure them. Plenty of evidence around that. So maybe something to talk about later. Okay, I promised I'd touch on this. This is wonderful work. This is worth looking up the original paper on there, open access. Len Berry is a fabulous guy working in the States, and essentially the two key points here. Number one is Len Berry demonstrated that kinder care in patients with cancer leads to better outcomes. Okay, if I had a microphone, I'd drop it at this moment. Okay, kinder care leads to better outcomes in patients with cancer. So all this sort of, it's just a bit soft and fluffy stuff is total nonsense. That sounds pretty good to me. And then what I love about this work is he and his team have beautifully codified what do they mean by kind care. Okay, if anyone's still got a bit of energy left in the room, here's a moment for deep reflection. Look at these 6 things here. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to stand like this. Look at these 6 things. Quickly, mentally, score yourself out of 10 for each of these things. Or just on, don't have to tell anyone, just deep honesty. How good are you at each of these things? Okay, for the record, nobody in the room is currently scoring 10 on anything. I'm certainly not. All of us can get better at each of these things. How next week could you score yourself 1 more on 1 or 2 of these things? I've got really interested in how you get better at listening. I have some major disadvantages. I'm an extrovert. I'm full of ideas. It's not all happy at that position. Yeah, I'm not as good at listening as I should be. How do you get better at deep listening? Look at the language here. Generous acts of discretionary effort that go beyond what patients and families expect. Wonderful guy, Michael Morton. He died 5 years ago in his early 90s. He was our first patient leader at Imperial. on our Strategic Lay Forum, and he had this gorgeous phrase. He said, value the patient's time. Think how much time we waste to people. Think how much anxiety people have sitting on. So that really quick phone call, just to let people know, I've just had a look for your kid's MRI result. It's not back yet, but as soon as it is there, I'll give you a call back. That little tiny thing that values things. So gorgeous stuff there, and it's got a wonderful evidence base. It leads to better outcomes. Okay, the incredible Michael West. Lots of you will have heard Michael talk. He has spent 35, probably now 40 years researching teams and what makes high-performing teams. And if you haven't looked at Michael's work or looked up a YouTube or things, do. Again, beautiful stuff here. Attending, paying attention to staff, listening with fascination. That's actually Nancy Klein's phrase in Time to Think. Just gorgeous stuff. Just a little tiny bit of sort of self-help for us all. These things called mobile phones, yeah, you know them? They're a problem. Okay, they get in the way. So the idea that you can be on the phone to your, put in whatever name you want, mum, sister, friend, partner, child, and also tapping out an email or doing a bit of internet shopping on things is nonsense. You can't. We kid ourselves that we can multitask, but at any one moment, you can actually only do one thing. I mean, you can do brainstem stuff like breathe and things like that. But I'm talking about things that require a bit of attention. So think about the quality about where you listen to people. And actually thinking about appreciation and Mike's piece, one of the really greatest gifts you can give people is just that little bit of time. So actually Adrian's lovely story about that I'd forgotten, but I was remembering as Adrian was talking about talking, is actually just making yourself available to people, just to listen. I usually don't have anything wise to say, but that slow down, that listen, feels really important. Understanding, empathizing, and I love this last one, helping, taking intelligent action to serve or help. It's stuff we do really well with our kids, don't we? Encourage them to be helpful, be kind, be helpful. I love the idea of just being helpful. Interesting, in challenging people about poor behavior, I find the phrase, that was neither kind nor helpful, quite a clear way to open up a sweaty palm conversation, as I'm forever going to call it. Okay, final bit of educational theory of evidence. This stuff is fantastic. Mike referenced, didn't he, psychological safety in a big way, and two sort of areas of research to look at. On the left is Project Aristotle. So this was stuff that Google, for very commercial, hard-edge reasons, invested a lot of money in. Very simple question. For commercial reasons, what makes a highly performing team? They wanted to know what makes our teams perform the most. They did a whole load of ethnography. They spent a lot of money on it, and the answer is in those coloured bars on the left. Okay, people need to see their work has impact, that their work has meaning. They need to have some structure and clarity to their work. People need to be dependable with each other. And hey, here's the big one. It's got to be psychologically safe. Okay, so I love the acid test for me. So the weekend before last, I was the attending consultant Friday, Saturday, Sunday on the wards. I turn up on a Friday morning. I have this sort of busy exec job, so it means I turn up on the ward. I have not got a Scooby-Doo what's going on. I'm slightly scared and worrying about it. But I'm sort of a bit old and grey and senior, and people sort of, the boss has arrived sort of thing. So the question is, in my head, is what can I do to make the environment as psychologically safe as possible? The student nurse, who's young, female, different ethnic background, on her first day on the ward, how would she genuinely feel safe, feel comfortable to say, I'm really sorry, I might have got this wrong, but I think we might have given that medicine to that little boy already? Can I be really, really confident that the way I conduct myself, the way the team are working, behaving, that she would feel confident enough to do that? To be wrong. Maybe she's completely wrong. Yeah, it's all fine, we've given it. But could she say that? Could she feel comfortable to say that? And there are a million other examples, but it's that sort of real story we've got to ask ourselves. And you can think you're the most lovely, kind, I'm such a lovely, nice, accessible person. Anyone can talk to me. But we've got to be real about it. We've got to be sensible and real about it. So psychological safety, really key. And there is nobody I've discovered in the world more attuned and expert on this than Amy Edmondson. And lots of you will have read lots of her books and things. And I'll tell you a bit about our conversation in a minute. The next conversation we've got in a week's time is with Amy Edmondson, so that'll be fun. So we'll tell you about that. So really quick bit to finish off with, leading with kindness. And I was thinking about this, and hence I put the bit about hope. So everybody knows this story, I suspect, but let's just enjoy it, because there is no better story, is there, than 1962. This looks a bit like a corridor here, and there's a janitor at NASA who's busy sweeping the floor. And President Kennedy is on a visit. The Americans are spending insane amounts of their GDP on space. And he goes and meets the astronauts, meets the space station commander. And like a president of the old days, I don't think they're very good at this chit-chat anymore, but he bumps into this janitor and he says, "What are you doing here?" And the janitor, the cleaner, points up and says, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." So the guy with a broom in the corridor is helping put a man on the moon. He's completely connected to mission and purpose. And it was a crazy project, wasn't it? If you think about the tech of the 1960s and to get on the moon, but that's the feeling of hope. So I love that story, and then I sort of get a bit sort of romantically entitled with it all and think, but actually in healthcare, we've got an even better mission. There's no better mission, as actually all of the speakers before outside healthcare have pointed out. Malala's amazing father crying, talking about the care that was received here in this city. Mike talking about his sort of, I can't really understand what you guys are having to do in healthcare. So we have the ultimate mission. We all choose when we're teenagers with great clarity that we want a career in it. And yet we've done something to the way we work that we cloud this. We put treacle on it. We blur it. Okay, so here's a bit of a challenge. So we've had a sort of, you've had lots of fun today, but let's get a bit gritty about it. There's a leadership ask here to reconnect with that mission, with that purpose. And I think that's where we're going to get the hope from. Not that sort of distant hope, but real gritty hope that actually we can make things better. Okay, really feels really important to me about the future, that we're really serious about that. So that reconnect, and I like the word reconnect, because it was there. Every single person who works in healthcare had it, and may still have it with bells on, but I think it's tucked away, and we need to bring that out in people. So I guess just a couple of thoughts is if we're really clear about what the mission is in healthcare. So I have, as an executive at Imperial College Healthcare, it's like a £1.6 billion turnover organisation, and we're sort of 50 million in the red at the minute. There's a responsibility as a member of that board to balance the books and the like. However, talking about money all the time is a problem. We need to be talking about care all the time. We need to be talking about this all the time. So there's clarity of mission, and there's this focus on kindness. And you marry these things up, the evidence shows people have increased purpose and meaning in their work. They have more joy in their work. They feel more psychologically safe. There's greater empathy and compassion. And the evidence of people like Len Berry, and indeed all of your speakers today have highlighted time after time the evidence that sits behind it, leads to better patient and population outcomes. So the idea that we have a healthcare system where Secretary of State sort of shouts in the ear of Amanda Pritchard at the top of NHS England and various bits of performance management and shouting sort of come down, and that's going to deliver great outcomes, it's just crazy. Evidence shows it's crazy, because you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. And the sort of evidence that we've been spending today getting to grips with also shows it's crazy. So we've got to stop doing it. Okay, where do we get some of the inspiration from? Well, the trick is, as Mike and others have said, is from other people. So back to that moment 4.5 years ago, and I started having a conversation about this. I started to chat to some other people, and they said, well, look, we need to talk about this, and we need to do some stuff about this. And what's so wonderful is you've got people like Adrian and Emma, and you've got people like Chris, and you've got people doing the What Matters to You work, an amazing friend, Kath Crock in Australia. There's people all around the world who are standing up and saying, and there's all of you standing up and saying, we've got to do something different. And we've got to do it in a way that's much more asset-based, that's curious, that's about learning. And this, just to give a shout out to some wonderful friends across the US and Sweden and New Zealand and Australia, who've been particularly fabulous in helping sort of lead this conversation. And this started by that little group of people meeting and talking. And as we started to share out, we decided the single most useful thing to do was just to make it open. And it's got completely out of hand, a bit like Learning for Excellence and a bit like Civility Saves Lives. Totally out of hand, with people coming and getting involved from now 34 different countries. Okay, this was not by design. Sort of rapidly trying to think, in retrospect, how do you sort of design a sort of movement around things? So just to share with you, just to finish off, a little bit of learning. So we've met for 36 consecutive months. There's a few of you in this room who've been a critical part of that. I can see Anna smiling away there. So the first bit, just to be clear on, and I think this is probably the one thing to really take away, is kindness is a choice of action. Okay, it is not some sort of thing out there. It's how you behave. So Mike was talking about appreciation in a sense about what you value in somebody. It's what you value actually in the way they behave. He uses the phrase in who they are. But as I was reading that, I was thinking, yeah, it's who they are, but it's how they behave. It's what they stand for. That's what you really appreciate in people. So it is a choice of action. Okay, I've touched on this. I'm yet to find anything more effective than the deliberate act of kindness. And Mike would say of gratitude, to create psychological safety. And the evidence shows that's the single most useful thing to create a high-performing team. So when we're with Amy Edmondson in a week's time, we're going to be exploring this idea. Gee, is there a better tool than kindness? Than behaving in a civil way? Than focusing on how do we learn from things that have gone right? It's going to be super interesting on that. We've touched on the evidence, which is the piece on the top right. There's definitely a piece with leading with kindness in terms of creating the right environments to work and tackling and challenging burnout. I was looking at your banner over there, working together to make healthcare a better place to work. It's a critical part of it. So a bit in the middle here about systematically challenging unkind behaviours, and I put and exploring why. So I went into this very much on the asset-based sort of track, but I've got much, much harder about this idea that you have to challenge, and I feel very fueled by two things. I mean, Mike and his sweaty palms. So I'm always learning. That sweaty palm conversation, his point being, you're better off having that conversation than not. That was about his single biggest learning point that I took away. And then Malala's extraordinary father saying, Malala was more fearful of not talking to the Taliban than talking to them, as fearful as she was. So how do we start changing this, that we should be more fearful of walking past unkind behaviours and letting them go on? Because the evidence shows the destruction and issues they cause. How does that give us some strength and some courage to challenge? One other hopeful note is I'm really hard-nosed about this, and it helps that I'm 6'3" and male and white and a doctor and an executive. I've got all of the advantage on that. So I'm really hard-nosed, and I have a phrase that says, I don't care how important you think you are, I'll take you on unkind behaviours. And so I've got more and more bold on it. When you go, it's a two-stage process. Number one is being really tough and bold. And the second bit is then somewhat putting your arm around somebody and say, what's going on? And when you do that, you find all sorts of extraordinary things that are going on in people's lives, at home, at work. There's often a self-esteem piece. There are very, very few people. I've never come across anyone who is actively evil. I mean, you see them in the news every so often. This is largely just people like us who are finding things difficult, and they're expressing themselves in a way that is unkind. That is not acceptable. So this idea, I'm just having a bad day, so therefore I can behave. No. Kindness is a choice of action. So you are choosing to behave in that way, but the context that life might be really hard for you is a really important one. There's a really, really key piece here about training. And I'm really, really interested. And I think going forward, and it's a great area for us to scheme and collaborate on whatever your interest around things. There's definitely this piece on measurement, and I touched on this. And there's this wonderful paper I touched on, Getting the Measure of Kindness. It's on the Carnegie UK Trust website. It's worth a read. How do you measure the conditions for these things? How do you measure activities? How do you measure outcomes? And then this beautiful thing that we've touched on. Okay, Malala's dad and his smile and thumbs up. Okay, kindness is a cycle. Being kind stimulates more kindness, which grows the impact. But I think, just think hard about this. It was Mike who was saying, wasn't it? The single biggest thing we all have power on is how we behave, how we can influence things. So make this a starting point. Okay, genuine, drop me a line about anything, but drop me a line if you want to come and be part of the conversations. We meet every third Thursday of the month, between 6 and 7. If you're in the UK, it's really civilized time. If you're like Kath Crock in Australia, it's usually 3 o'clock in the morning. She's currently going to get into the Kath sit there when we're in our summer wearing about 7 overcoats and things like that. I think that's all going to change. But come and join the conversations. We've got Amy Edmondson in November, in a week's time. We've got Michael West joining us just before Christmas. They're great fun. They're lots of learning. It's a really amazing community. We've got a really rudimentary website with some resources. Have a little look there if that's helpful. 3 things to leave you with. Okay, inspired by Mike. Mike wanted us to think about what we can influence as individuals. So when I look at these 3 questions, this isn't like what Bob. Well, it is. I'll think about it. I'm going to come and be in the audience again. So you guys need to read this and have a think. What am I going to do? Act. What am I going to act on? And don't make a decision on this now, but think about it on the train home. Think about it at the weekend. Think about it next week when you work. What am I going to do to increase the focus on kindness, to build a sense of hope, and to reconnect myself, but also my colleagues with the real mission in healthcare? So that's question 1. Question 2 plays to the fear piece about the sweaty palm conversation. And when you hear about Malala's extraordinary story, you sort of think, hang on, we probably overplay how difficult these things are. We probably duck too many, as Mike describes, sweaty palm conversations. So when I see unkind behaviors, what am I prepared to walk past? How do I make walking past actually harder than intervening? And then I guess on a more asset positive base to finish with is, what are the always events I can promote, I can role model in my leadership of high quality, safe, equitable care? Okay, definitely enough from me. This final picture, one of you wondering, what's this picture all about? This is a gorgeous thing. And, the internet can sometimes be a horrible, toxic place, and social media rightly has a poor reputation. I saw this photo pop up, and I thought, this is just beautiful. And what's so amazing is within 24 hours, I tracked down who these people were. And I'm no detective. And it's a gorgeous story. This is from a care home in South Wales. And Sharon is the manager of the care home, who I got in touch. I think she must have thought I was really properly weird, and said, feel free to use the photos. So Richard is the guy who's 87 in the wheelchair being wheeled in. And those of you who know Wales, that sea is cold, isn't it? And this is Margaret a little bit. And if you look really closely, just look at her face. The sea is really cold, isn't that? And then Adele is a care assistant at the top end. And then this is Joe, who's a volunteer from the rugby club. And I sort of think, on that thing that a picture tells 1,000 words about care, about what counts. And it's a beautiful little scheme where they'd set up sea wheelchairs and they were getting people out the nursing home and wheeling them into that lovely cold sea. So anyway, that's the finish. Adrian, Emma, back over to you.
That's brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you very much. A great way to wrap up the conference. We could, I don't know if we've got much time, but I've had a niggling question that came up. I thought I'd give you a really, really difficult one.
Okay, lovely. Thanks.
But clearly, I think there's a logic model and a research model, evidence model to say if there is kindness going on in a team, then the outcomes will be better downstream. Do you think it makes a difference if we direct that more towards the staff and colleagues or more towards the patients? Or is it just, we just need to get it out there everywhere? You know, should we put the patients absolutely first, prioritize everything on them, potentially at the risk of then neglecting our team, or vice versa? It's a hypothetical one, so I'm not saying there's an answer to this, but it's just, I'll tell you my hunch on it. I think actually there's more benefit of putting the team first, because if you get your house in order, you can then deliver the care that you aspire to give.
Yeah. So let's go, here we go. So, yeah, I think I'm always, I don't know whether this is just like ducking issues or whether this is like old age wisdom or neither, but generally I'm sort of inclined to think the answer is usually somewhere in the middle. But you've used the word logic. I like the logic. I think it's a defendable logic to play in on that. The worries I have about that sometimes is we don't connect well enough the fact that you've got well-being and a high-performing team to the outcomes that matter to patients. So I think there's a connecting piece there that feels really, really key. And then the only other bit is I think sometimes the sort of joy and stuff the other way. So my hunch is that's not a bad logical model to go in, but actually if you really think, where do we get, you know, that privilege we have as people directly delivering care of seeing the smile and thumbs up from somebody, or seeing somebody get a bit better, or seeing, there's something about making sure that connection is really rich. I worry about staff well-being stuff that's sort of tucked too far on the side. So I think thinking about it, and this bit about conditions, where the conditions are right for staff, they're sort of right for patients. But how? It took a global pandemic of a once-in-a-century proportions for us in this country and many other healthcare systems to realise that looking after your staff is essential to care. I mean, I'm not going to swear, but seriously, that's like catastrophic leadership failure. And lots of us in this room are complicit in that. Yeah. So this is the point of days like today, is to say, we've got to find a new track. That's just total nonsense. So I think that's right, but let's be careful not making sure we connect to patients.
Yeah, it was an unfair question. But I think perhaps, let's just be kind to everyone and not forget the staff, which is maybe what we've done in the past. Right, thanks, Bob. Round of applause for the wonderful Bob Klaber, please.